Hey guys! So we're finally starting our inventory today, which is really exciting. It's a really fun element to program and obviously an extremely important mechanic to the game. And now again, although this is obviously part of the Farming RPG series, we won't really be relying on any previous elements from previous episodes to make our inventory system, so if you haven't seen any of those and you've just come here wondering how to make an inventory, that's totally fine. We're going to be adding totally new objects and data structures to build our inventory over the next few episodes. Alright, so let's get started. Now our goal for today is to get most of the inventory set up, so this is what we should be getting by the end. So here is the inventory user interface drawing, right? Which is just this box with the 3 tabs. And this kind of breaks up the inventory into 3 sections. So at the top here in the first tab is the player information. We've got a name where we can show our player's name. We've got some gold, silver, and copper with some numbers showing you how much of each coin that we have. So that's one section. Next, and probably the most important part, is our actual inventory. So you can see here it's got 24 slots with 3 rows of 8, and I've just filled it with a random assortment of items. And if I restart the game, you can see that it randomizes all the spots, as well as the money, actually. As an aside, I've put links to all of the sprites for this in the description, but you should also be able to use your own sprites for all of this, and make the inventory any size or number of slots that you want. You'll just have to change a couple calculations that we do, but don't worry, I'll point all of that out. Anyway, so that's the second part. And then finally down here, this is where we're going to put the description for the items. So we won't actually get to that today. We'll be doing that next time, but just keep those sections in mind. So like I said, we're just going to be concentrating on the first 2 sections today. And if you hadn't guessed it already, we're going to be using data structures to store the information for each of these. So in the first section, for the player information, we're going to be making a grid data structure. So it's going to have a width of 2 and a height of 4. And these numbers here, they just represent the coordinates of the grid. So this cell here is 0, 0. This cell here is 1, 2. So just like with a lot of our other data structures that we've already made, each row here is going to be representing a different kind of object or information. So this first row here, this is going to be about gold. So the cell 0, 0, we're going to be storing just the string gold. And then in 1, 0, we're going to store the amount of gold that we have. Obviously, this could be any number, I've just put in 1. And this cell here is going to be the one that we're most interested in. It's going to be the one we're probably going to use the most when we're actually getting to the code. So we'll be changing this cell if we acquire or spend gold. This one here is sort of less useful, but it might come up sometimes. And the reason I even want to store this string gold at all is so that we can refer to it in things like conversations or as a notification for when we pick up the gold. Alright, and in the next couple rows, the silver and the copper is exactly the same. And finally, in the next part, we just have the name, string, and player, again for the same reasons as all of these. And we'll allow the player to change this value themselves eventually. And we might add more things to this player information grid a bit later, or you might want to do it right now, but this is all I'm going to be doing. Alright, now for the inventory. So here is basically what our inventory grid is going to look like. It's going to have a width of 2, and its height is going to be however many slots that you want in your inventory. And I'm just using 8 as an example. So each row represents a new item, and this column, the first column, is going to store what kind of item that it is. So basically each item type is going to be represented as a number. So 5 might be carrot, 7 might be potion, whatever. They're all just going to be represented by numbers. And in the second column here, this is just going to be how many of each item that we have. And this all looks pretty incomprehensible to the human eye, right? So to help us out a bit, we're going to declare all our item indexes using an enumerator. So we've done this before, and it's going to be pretty much the same. So we're calling this enumerator item, and then we're going to list all of the items that we have here. And importantly, we have the very first item is actually going to be none, and it's going to be equal to 0. And this is important because we're going to set the inventory slot to this item when it has nothing in it. So we do need a kind of empty slot here. And then we just number all of our items sequentially after that. Now, this, if you recall, is just the way that an enumerator will assign entries their values even if you don't put equals something here, right? It'll just make it equal to 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, blah. So if I'd written this instead, it would be exactly the same. But I am actually going to keep it like this in the inventory because if you imagine that we have, say, 100 different items, you can't really tell at a glance what starfish is going to be, especially if we're like 50 items down, but this way we can see what each number is equal to. So remember, this was our inventory, and instead of just these numbers, we could put this, right? They're exactly equivalent. So this is how we access the constants in our enumerator. We just put item dot and then whatever the item was, right? So item.corn is exactly the same as just writing 2. Now finally, even though we're setting up the inventory in a kind of list fashion, right? So it's just coming straight down with each row being a new item. That doesn't mean our actual inventory is necessarily going to look like this. You can do it that way if you want, but we are going to set it up so that you can specify how many rows and columns are in the actual inventory. So even though we have 8 slots here in our DS inventory grid, you could, for example, make an inventory like this. So while the data structure has a height of 8 and a width of 2, we can have our inventory itself being a different width and height. So we're actually going to use some variables to set this up. So we're going to have inventory slots, and that's just going to be however many slots you have available for your inventory. Obviously, this is going to be the same as the height of the grid. And then we're going to declare a width and a height. And that will determine the actual inventory that the player sees. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what we're going to be doing. Let's jump into the code and get started. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is import those sprites. So I'm going to make a new sprite group called inventory. So this one is our user interface UI sprite. So this is going to have, if we just go into it, the actual kind of inventory menu thing, right? And that's basically all of this right here. And as you can see, these squares here, they look a little bit different to what I showed in the preview, right? And this is if you wanted to do something like, say, give the player only 8 inventory items at the start, the rest are going to appear like this. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to manually draw on how many inventory slots the player actually has on top of these. And as you can see as well, I've actually just put the coins directly on top of this sprite as well. And actually there's a bit of space here, so in the sprite that I'll give to you, I'll actually get rid of this. Alright, so that's the UI sprite. And we can just leave it there. It doesn't really matter where its origin is. Let's do the rest. So let's grab the items now. And if I just go into this one, so as you can see, I haven't put many items in here. And I've made the sprite pretty big just in case you wanted to put lots more in, or if we put some more in the coming tutorials. And basically each item is going to take up 32 pixels. So if you turn on the grid and then you type 32 by 32 here, you can see each of the items like this. Now, it's important that we leave the first one blank because this is going to be our no items. Because remember, the item.none in our enumerator, that's kind of like our first item. And then tomato then will be equal to 1, potato will be equal to 2, and so on. The other thing that I've just made sure to do is that I put enough items in the sprite so that it's going down to the second line because I just want to make sure that our maths works out a little bit later. All right, so that is our items. All right, last one. This is going to be our coins, and we're not actually going to use this one. This time we'll use it in the next one, but we might as well just import it now. And if you just take a note of what it's called right here, so it's SPR all coins, and then it says strip 8. And see, this is just one big picture, but if I import it, it automatically splits it up for me into 8 sort of frames. And if I play it for you right here, you can see they're just sort of spinning around. And we'll use that for the actual coin items that we'll put into the game world so that we can get some money. All right. Again, I'm just trying to keep everything as kind of compact as possible because I know we're running kind of low on the amount of sprites you have if you have the demo version of GameMaker, so I'm trying to reduce the number of sprites wherever possible. All right, so that's it for our sprites. Now we can go ahead and make our inventory object. So it's going to be one of our special sort of meta system objects. So we'll put it here, create a new object, and we'll call it inventory. And just like these ones, it's also going to be persistent. And before we forget, let's just add it to our initializing room. Now, one more thing, if you recall, everything in this instances layer, it has a depth of 0, right? And if you remember that our day cycle also exists at this depth, which means it's going to be drawing the lighting at this depth. But we want our inventory to be appearing on top of the day cycle. I don't want the light to be drawn on top of the user interface. So what I'm actually going to do, and we might change this later when we have a few more things set up like the text system, but in its create event, I'm just going to immediately just type depth equals to -1, just so that it is going to be on top of the lighting, right? Because if we have a lower depth, that means we're closer to the screen. So we're not as deep, basically. All right. So now we can get started setting up our inventory. Now, first up, let's start off simple and just get the UI back of the inventory to draw. So we're actually going to be drawing everything in the draw GUI layer, just so that we don't have to correct for the view all the time as we would have to in the draw layer. But because the draw GUI is unscaled, right? It doesn't get scaled like the rest of our game does, as we've discussed in earlier episodes. We're going to have to scale up the inventory for it to look correct for us. And if you remember, if we just come into one of our rooms, like the farm room, and come into the viewports. So here, this was the size of our viewport, and this was the size of our room. So the actual room that it's drawing is actually half the size of the actual viewport, which means it's scaling it up by a factor of 2. So we're also going to want to scale the inventory by 2. And to be honest, we are going to change a lot of the camera later. We might end up having to change that scaling factor, but for now, in the create event, I'm going to make a variable called scale and set this to 2. If you're using a different resolution, obviously you're going to have to correct for that. All right, next, so because of how I set this sprite up, I don't want to be drawing the entire sprite because that would draw this bit right here, and I don't want to draw any of that. I just want to draw this. And this thing right here, as you can see, it's got a width of 288 and a height of 192. So basically we want to only draw part of the sprite starting from here and just all of that. So in the draw GUI event, let's draw part of the sprite. And we could just name the sprite here, but what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to have variables that hold all of my sprites. And that's just because I'm going to be referring to them multiple times. So whenever I'm drawing, for example, 24 of these, I'm going to keep referring to this sprite here. And so I'm actually just going to store this sprite in a variable called spr env UI. Right, and so we'll refer to that. So the sub image that we have to give it is just 0. There's only one frame in that sprite that we had. This left and top is going to refer to where we're starting to draw. And if you just middle click on this, it'll bring up the documentation on that, and you can see right here. It's the X position on the sprite of the top left corner of the area to draw. So if you remember, that was 32 over this coordinate right here. And actually, instead of just using 32, so just in case you're using some different sprites, I'm going to make another variable called cell size. And this is going to be equal to 32. And this will be equal to not only the size of this thing, which is just the slots, but it's also going to be the size of your items. All right, so now the top is just going to be 0. It was right at the top. And now the actual width and height of that inventory. So it's just going to be those numbers I said before. So again, we're going to set up some more variables. So env UI width. Right, and that is the area that we want to draw. So the width and height of that area. All right, and now we have to give it an X and Y location to draw the inventory. So now I'm going to draw my inventory so that it's right in the center. So what we're going to have to do is get the width and height of the GUI layer and then just halve those. So again, we come into the create event and we'll make a couple variables. And I'll just put it here. So if we halve these two values, that's going to put it right in the center. But if we start drawing there, that's going to be the corner of the inventory. So the corner will be in the center. So, but to correct for that, we're going to need to minus half of the inventory UI width and minus half of its height as well. And then it'll be in the center. But actually, it's not even as simple as that, because we're going to have to correct for this scale variable. So if we're scaling it by 2, then the entire thing that we're drawing is going to take up twice as much room. So we need it to move 2 times half its width and 2 times half its height. So again, we need some more variables. So I'm going to have an inv UI x position, GUI width times 0.5 or GUI width over 2, whatever you want. And then half of the inventory width, and then again, times the scale. And that will get us the number we want. And we want to do the same for the y, just with the height. All right, and now we can put these values into here. And now, so for the x scale and the y scale, we're just going to put our scale variable. So this is turning out to be quite a long line. You might want to put it over several lines or something like this, if you want to see it all. And finally, so the color, which is like the image blend. So if you wanted to blend it green or something for some reason, then you would put that in here, but we don't want to do any of that. So we just put white, which is the default. And finally, the alpha, which is just going to be 1. Okay, so if we run the game now, we should get our inventory to draw. There we go. Good, okay. One other quick thing we'll do is actually, we'll just make it so that if we tap the I key, we'll toggle the inventory being drawn or not. So whenever I hit I, it'll make the inventory come up or go away. So we will create a variable called show inventory. And I'll start it off as true for the purposes of our testing right now. So it should be appearing. And in the step event, we'll say, if we press the I key, then we're going to make whatever this is currently equal to. So true or false, it's going to equal not whatever it's equal to. So if it's currently true, then it's going to make it equal not true and vice versa. So it's just going to keep toggling. And then in here, we'll say at the very top, if not show inventory. So if this is false, then we're just going to exit and we're not going to do any of this. So just real quick, if we just test that and hit I, yep, works perfectly. Okay, let's keep doing our setup now. So now let's draw that player information stuff. So down here, we will start setting up player info. All right, and so we're going to make our data structure here with our gold, silver, copper, and name variables, if you remember. And you don't have to put this, but just so that you remember our first row was going to be the gold, the second row was the silver, bronze, and then the name. Okay, so let's create a grid called ds player info, ds just for data structure, ds grid create. So a width of 2 and a height of 4. Or if you're adding other pieces of information, then increase this value accordingly. And now let's go ahead and just fill the grid with the values that we want. So we use our accessor here to access the cell that has whatever coordinates that we put in here. So the very top left cell, the very first cell, which has the coordinates 0, 0, we're going to put our gold string in. And then the cell right beneath it, we put the silver string. And we keep going just like that. All right, and now for this next bit. So for our second column, so the x values will now be 1 instead of 0. So we'll just copy this and then change the x values to 1. So for name, we put whatever name you want your character to have. I'm just going to put player. And you can put whatever values you want here, but I'm actually just going to randomize it to make it a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to give it a random value. And because I put I here, this means integer. So it's going to be a whole number. And then we give it a range. So between two numbers. And I'm going to give it between 0 and 99. And I'm just going to do that for all of these. All right. So we have created and filled our grid. And actually, before we forget, because we have created a data structure and GameMaker does not delete data structures unless we tell it to, we have to remember to destroy it in the event that the inventory is destroyed. So if the game ends or if this object gets destroyed, but we can just use the cleanup event instead of creating those events individually. So we go ds grid destroy player info. All right. So now we need to actually draw this stuff to the screen. So let's just start with the name. So let's create an X and Y location for the info as well. So let's go info X and info Y. And now if we come back to the sprite, the place that I want to draw this is about here. So about 9 pixels across and 9 pixels down. So I'm going to say, wherever we're drawing the back, draw the player info 9 pixels down and across. So I'm just going to say these two values plus 9. But it's not actually just 9 again, because remember, because we're scaling everything, we need to say 9 times scale. Okay. And actually, another thing that I want to do that we haven't done yet is let's make our own sort of custom fonts that we're going to be drawing all of this in, because otherwise it'll just use the default font. So I'm going to create a few. So for now, let's just make FNT text a font at size 12. And I'm going to make this font. Now, I actually have this one that I just found online. It's just a free font that I quite like. I'll leave a link in the description. It's really easy to install, but you can use any font that you like. I'm going to pick this one. And I'm also going to turn off anti-aliasing, which kind of smooths the text. Because we're doing a pixel art game, it tends to look a bit weird if you're smoothing the text, so I'm going to have it turned off. I'm also just going to duplicate this and have a bigger size. And I'm going to use this one to draw the name. And actually, let's make one more. I'm going to use this one for the number of items that we have. So the small numbers that are going to appear in each square that denote the amount of each item. And I'm going to set this one to Korea 10 pitch. And I'm going to make this one 14. I've just played around with this and I think this looks quite nice. And I'm going to turn off anti-aliasing. All right. Cool. So let's come back to here. So now when we draw our name, we're going to be using one of those fonts. Now, which is kind of just going to be a good practice tip for when you're programming with data structures. So whenever you refer to a data structure, it's actually going to be quicker to access it as a local variable than as an instance variable. So if you're accessing a data structure multiple times in an event that's run every step of the game, right? So like in the step event, which is run 60 times, which is going to be the same for the draw GUI. So if you're doing this 60 times in a second and referring to it 8 times, it's going to start to add up. So for example, we could go like that, and it would make this a little bit faster. So it doesn't really matter for the create event because we're just doing this once at the start of the game. So I'm not even going to bother for this. But we will do that here because we are going to be referring to it multiple times in this draw GUI event. So I'm going to go like that. And now we're actually going to draw the text. So we're going to use the function draw text color. And the XY location that we're going to be drawing this text at is just going to be these variables that we set here. Info X and Y. And now the string that I wanted to draw. So what I want it to draw is basically name and then whatever this is. So we're going to access this twice to draw both those strings. So I'm going to go info grid. So, and remember their cell coordinates. So this one was 0, 3 and this one's 1, 3. So 0, 3. And then what you can do is you can actually add strings together. So I'm going to add firstly a little colon thing just to separate them, and then like that. So now we have to give it a color and an alpha value. So I'm just going to make a local variable C equal to the color black, just so I can set all these a bit quicker. And the alpha is just going to be 1. And one more thing that we should do right here is set that font that we set up. There we go. Let's have a look at that. All right. So now let's draw those coin values. Because they do exist. We set them here, but we just aren't drawing them yet. Now, what I'm going to do, and this is very specific to the sprite that I have set up because of exactly where they're located. So I have worked out these numbers. If you're using a different sprite, you're going to have to set this up yourself. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use a repeat statement to draw the 3 of these, just incrementing this variable each time and changing the coordinates of it slightly. So what I'm going to do is firstly change the font, and I'm going to set up a repeat loop just like we've done many times before. So, and I'm repeating it 3 times because there's 3 things I want to draw. And every time I repeat this loop, I'm going to increment this value. So we again draw text color. But now for our X and Y for these, I have kind of found the exact pixel locations that I want. So it's basically the first one is going to start 192 pixels across, but again, I have to times it by the scale because we're scaling everything up by 2. So that will get me to where the gold coin is, but then I also have to add some sort of variable number for the times that I repeat, and I want to draw the other ones. So I'm going to have 15 plus 18, and 18 is just the width of the coins. So I'm basically going 1 coin width plus another 15, and then I'm going to times that by the scale, of course. Then I'm going to times that by YY. So for the first one, this is just going to be 0. But for when YY is 1, we're going to kind of go 1 coin across. So, and the Y value though, that's just nice and simple. It's going to be exactly the same as all of the other info. So we can just put info Y. And finally, the actual string, because we have to give it a string, is going to be these. But these are actually numbers, right? Which is a different kind of data type. So what we're going to have to do is convert it to a string. We just put string in here, which is going to convert it to a string for us. And then we access its location in the grid. So info grid, and it's in column 1, right? So X is 1. Oops, forgot our accessor. So 1, and then the Y coordinate will just be whatever YY is currently equal to. And I might just put this over multiple lines so that we can see it. There we go. And finally, for the color, so I might actually just keep it as black, so it's currently set to black. And we'll just, you can change it if you want though. And the alpha value. All right, so if we run the game now, it should draw those numbers. Yep, so it's drawing our numbers for us. And if we just hit R, which will restart the game, there we go. So we're randomizing the numbers. Okay, good. So now let's move on to the inventory itself. And same as before, let's come back to the create event because there's a few variables that we're going to need to set up. So just like our info grid, we're going to need to set where we want to start drawing the inventory from. So let's come back to our UI sprite. So you can see the inventory is going to start right here. So its X value is just 9 across. So it's just like the info. So it's going to be equal to whatever info X is. And then it's going to be 40 down from wherever this is. So let's go ahead. So we'll call this slots because this is the inventory slot. So we'll go slots X. And so like I said, it's going to be equal to this one. For you, it might be something different if you're putting it in a different location with your different sprites. And the y is going to be whatever this is plus 40. Of course, times by the scale. Okay, now there's a few more things I need. So we're going to be referring to our inventory sprite here, and I'm going to create a variable called spr_inv items. Like that, because we're going to be referring to this a lot. And for our system to be nice and flexible, I'm actually going to want to get the rows and columns of our sprite here. And you'll see why in a second, but you can see that it's basically going to be whatever its width is divided by our cell size. So the width of this whole thing is 512, so divided by 32, that will get us 16 columns and 8 rows. So that's for my sprite. So we're going to create a couple new variables. So the number of columns and the number of rows in the inventory. And basically we're going to need to know this so that when we're accessing the specific item, basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to look at this and then be incrementing. So if I wanted to get, for example, the carrots, which should be number 3, so 0, 1, 2, 3, it's going to want to find this value here. But if we want to get the mushroom, we want to know if it's reached the max amount of columns to loop back to the start and look on this row. So that's why we're going to need those values. Anyway, let's come back. Next, we're going to set some pretty important values for the actual inventory. So our slots, and this will be the number of slots that you want in your inventory. So I am going to set mine to, actually let's just do 16 for now. I'll have 24 at the end, but I just want to check if everything that we draw is correct. So the width is going to be 8 and the height is going to be 2. Actually, why don't we just make it a weird odd number and we'll do like that. Okay, and now let's actually set up the data structure for our inventory. So down here, we'll create another little section, inventory. And remember, so the column 0 is going to be the item itself, and then column 1 is going to be the amount of that item that we have. All right, so let's create our actual data structure. So we're going to have ds inventory is what I'm going to call it, and it's going to be a grid. So a width of 2, and then the height is going to be however many inventory slots that we have. And now let's set up the items. So we'll set up our enumerator. Item, and we'll name all of them. So here I'm just going to go down my sprite and basically just name all of these. And of course we have to start off with the none item, which is going to be at the index of 0. And like I said, you don't have to put these, but I think it just makes it a bit easier to read, especially if we want to know what a specific item's index is. We can just look at this really quickly and tell. So we'll do the same for the rest of the items. All right, so that's all our items, and you can fill it with however many items that you want. And I'm also just going to add at the very bottom of whatever you've got here, height. There isn't really a function that we can call to get the total number of entries in an enumerator, but you can use this trick because you can see right here that our entries, they go from 0 to 16, which means that we have 17 entries. So whatever this value equals, this is going to be the number of entries that we have. So it's just a neat little trick to get the height of your enumerator. And now what I'm going to do is kind of like here when we just filled our gold, copper, and silver with a random number, I'm going to fill our inventory with some random values. So for example, if you wanted to just add like a bucket to the inventory, what you would do is just write ds inventory and then a cell in your inventory. So just 0, 0, for example, for the first one, and make that equal to whatever item that you're putting it in. And then in the second column, you put however many there's going to be. But to fill it randomly, what we're going to do is we're going to use a repeat statement again. So I'm just going to set up just like we've done many times. And the number that we're going to repeat is just going to be however many inventory slots that we have, because I want to fill every single slot. So we're going to be looping through the whole inventory. And each time we loop, we're going to increment by y. And then we're going to grab, and the row will just be whatever y currently is. So we start at 0, and we're going to loop through the whole thing. And instead of specifying this, I'm going to say, so basically we want a random number between 1 and whatever our height is. Except we don't want to actually include this one, so we go height minus 1. So let's go irandom range. So 1, because I don't want to include the none item, and item.height minus 1. And for the amounts, you can put whatever you want here. I'm just going to put between 1 and 10. So I'm just going to delete this now. And before I forget, so we've created our data structure, we've declared all our numbers, and we've filled it in random slots. So what we should do actually is remember whenever we create a data structure, we have to delete it. So let's come into the cleanup and add it to this. Like that, there we go. And now let's come into the draw GUI and we'll actually be drawing the inventory. So again, we're going to be using a repeat statement for this, because basically we want to loop through that entire inventory grid and draw the appropriate sprite from our sprite items and also the amount. So let's just set up our repeat loop. So we're repeating however many inventory slots that we have. Basically, the logic of what we're going to do is, so for every single slot, we're going to have to get the X and Y location for the slot. We're going to have to pull out the item from our item grid, and then we're going to have to draw the slot. So by slot, I mean we're going to draw this thing over here. So we're going to have to draw that for every single one. And then we'll draw the item number, and then we'll increment our value that we're going to use to loop through the grid. And we're going to need quite a few variables for this, so I'm just going to declare them all here. So let's start off with these ones. And basically these II, IX, and IY. So this II is basically going to be the current item index that we're on. So this is the one that we're going to be incrementing down here. And then the IX and IY, this is going to be kind of the cell of the inventory that we're seeing on the screen. So these all start off at 0, and II is going to go from 0 to, so 17, we said we had 17 slots. But depending on what we've put for our inventory slots width, so as soon as IX hits 8, what it's going to do is it's going to reset back to 0, and then IY is going to increment to the next row. So that's how we're going to be controlling what row that we're on. So actually, let's just set out the logic for that. So II is going to be incrementing, and then IX is going to equal whatever II is, mod, and then whatever our width of our inventory slots. And what mod does, if we just middle click this, is mod is going to give us the remainder of a division. So if II is 9 and inventory slots is 8, then this is going to give us 1, right? So it's never going to go above 8. It's always just going to be kind of the remainder of whatever II divided by inv slots width. And slightly different for the IY. So kind of like the mod, but the div is going to give us the amount it can be divided by. So again, if we have 9 divided by 8, this 8 can only go into 9 once, so it's going to give us 1. So together, if II is 9, this will give us a remainder of 1, and this will give us row 1. All right. So now for XX and YY, so these are going to be the location of the current slot. So we're going to set these up here. So now XX is going to be, so we set up slots X, and that will be fine for our very first one, but we're going to need to add to this for all the rest. And actually there's one more thing that we need to set up, which is going to be the distance between the slots. So you can see here, the X distance, we'll call it an X buffer between them is 2, and the Y buffer is 4. So let's just put that in. And I'll put it here. So we're going to need that in our calculation. So we're going to say cell size plus the X buffer. So that's going to be kind of how much room 1 is taking up, how much room we want to move over for each slot. So then we're going to times that by whatever this is equal to, our horizontal coordinate for the slot. So times IX, and then times scale, of course, because we need to times all our pixels by the scale. All right, and then the same for the Y. But instead of X, we put Y. And IY. All right, so we've got our positions. Now for the actual item itself, so we're going to need a couple more variables up here. So I'm going to make a variable called iItem. I can't just use item because that's actually our enumerator, but this is going to be the current item that we're on, that we pull out of the grid. And I also want to declare our inventory grid as a local variable for the same reason as this up here. So we're going to set inv grid equal to our data structure, like this. And we'll set this one here equal to. So we're going to be in column 1, of course, because that's where we store what kind of item it is. And then whatever I currently is. Because remember, our grid is just a big long list, so we're just going down it one at a time. So this will get the item, so one of these from our grid. So, and then with this information, we have to go and find what sprite that we have to draw. So, kind of like this, we're actually going to need a sprite X and sprite Y. So if, for example, we want to draw this carrot, that will be number 0, 1, 2, 3. So we want to get basically the cell size times 3, the carrot's X location. So a couple more variables. So we're going to have SX and SY for sprite X and sprite Y. So SX is going to be, so whatever iItem is, so this is going to be a number, remember? So iItem mod the number of columns that we have. So exactly the same as this. What this will do is it's going to get whatever the number is divided by the total number of columns that there is, which means if it's over the number of columns that we have, right? So if it's this one, it's going to give us a remainder of 1 again. So we're going to get the correct X sort of column that we want. Okay. But this is going to give us a cell location because we've divided everything by cell size for these columns and everything. So here we're going to have to times it back by cell size because what we want is a X and Y position because that's where we're going to be drawing it. And we're going to do the same for the Y. This will probably make more sense when we're actually drawing it. So just like this, we put div. So let's actually draw the item itself. So we're going to draw sprite part ext. And this is probably going to be a long one. So now the sprite that we want is spr inv items. Because remember we set that variable here. The subimage is just 0. So now the location that we're going to be drawing from this, right? So the X and Y at the top, left and right is going to be here or here or here or here. So that is going to be what this is equal to. So we can put SX and SY. And the width we know is just going to be 32, which is our cell size. And the same for the height. And now the X and Y location to draw it at, which we figured out here. And finally, the X scale and the Y scale is just going to be our scale. And for the blend color, we don't want to blend it, so we'll just say white and an alpha of 1. Okay, so that's for drawing the slot. And actually, we need to draw one other thing. So remember how I said, so this is what, remember, this looks like at the moment. We also want to draw this if we actually have a slot at the location. So in addition to drawing the item itself, we're going to draw this thing right here, which we know is just going to be part of this whole sprite, starting at 0, 0, and then width of 32 and height of 32 across. So our UI sprite, so the left and top is just 0, 0, and then the width. So it's going to be at the same location as our item. It's also going to be scaled and see white and 1. Okay, and finally, we're just going to draw the number. And I'm actually going to say if the number is 0, I'm not going to draw the number. So first, I just want to check. So if we have the none item, right? So if we're getting this value here, then I don't want to draw this. And actually, I can put that here as well. So if we put if item is larger than 0, only then do we want to go and draw this. And the same for the number. So if it's larger than 0, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out the number. I'm just going to make a variable for this. So var number. So this is going to be equal to the inventory grid. So column 0, remember, was for the items. 1 is for the amount. So the amount is here, whatever our II value currently is. That will give us the number. And then we just draw text color, exactly the same as before at the X and Y location. And again, I'm just going to translate this into a string because this is actually a number and we're supposed to be giving this function a string, like that. And our C value up here, I think, is still set to black, and we'll just keep using that. Again, if you want to change that here, feel free to. And 1. Okay, I think we're done. So let's give that a run and see how it looks. There we go. So it's filled our grid and we have all of our slots in. And if I hit R, you can see it just randomizes all of our items. And we can't really interact with them at the moment, right? They're just in our inventory, but they are there. And next time we'll make so that we can select an inventory slot and move it around, and we can pick up items and drop them. So I'd like to thank everyone on Patreon who are supporting me to make these tutorials. And a special shout out to 3D Monkey Biz, Danielle Hargrave, Max Molinaro, and Uthelian for their support. I really appreciate it. I hope you guys are all well, and I'll see you next time.